Hey friends, welcome back to the Crooked Spoon. I'm so glad you're here. In today's video, we're going to be making one of my favorites, crumb cake. Follow along. So today I'm going to be using my Escali scale that I found on Amazon. All of my recipes are by weight, and I encourage you to think of your recipes in a different way. If you're using what most Americans use is the volume measurement, like a cup of flour or a half a cup of butter. But since baking is a science, the more accurate your measure, the more consistent your product will be. And so by doing what most of the rest of the world does and making recipes by metric weight, and I prefer grams and milliliters for liquids, you'll notice much more consistency every time you make the same baked good. So for today's video, I'm actually making 2 batches of crumb cake. I offer my customers an eighth of a sheet pan size for my crumb cake. So as we go in this video, you'll see that I'm starting with the streusel topping. And so I am making 2 separate bowls for each of the crumb cakes. The streusel topping is really what makes a crumb cake a crumb cake. My grandma used to make crumb cake when I was younger, and I swear her crumb to cake ratio was probably 2 to 1. She made these big, dense, buttery crumbs and had it on a very light and fluffy cake base. But for her, the bigger the crumb, the better. You'll often see that at bakeries. People really do want those beautiful, dense crumbs. This recipe is a little different. My base cake is very light and fluffy due to all of the baking powder. And to offset that, I do a smaller, medium-sized crumb, a more consistent crumb across the whole top of the cake. And I think that makes for not only a nice appearance, but you can eat it more easily. You can cut into it and the crumbs won't break apart. So my streusel is butter, granulated sugar, brown sugar, salt, cinnamon, and pastry flour. Now, if you don't have access to pastry flour, all-purpose flour will do fine. But again, as you practice your recipes, I do encourage you to experiment with the different kinds of flours that are out there. They all do have a purpose, different gluten and protein percentages. And I really think using pastry flour in this recipe is what helps us end up with a wonderfully moist crumb at the end. And when I say crumb, I also mean the texture of the cake as well. As I always do, I'll include this crumb cake recipe in the show notes below. And I also like to include some product links for the items that I have always used in my kitchen. This crumb cake has become a very popular item for my customers. I have pickup available on Thursday and Friday nights in my home bakery, and it is something that can last a day or two, so you can enjoy it for breakfast on Saturday morning, or as I grew up, we always used to have our crumb cake with either a glass of milk or a cup of coffee in the afternoon, a nice little pick-me-up snack in the afternoon. This recipe doesn't call for too much cinnamon, just enough to give it that flavor. And again, the benefit of making up these bowls of streusel ahead of time is that that butter will get a little bit up to room temperature. And when I go to blend it, it will mix quite easily with the dry ingredients. You can see my pastry flour comes from the supermarket nearby, which is Wegmans. That's honestly the only local supermarket that I could find that carries pastry flour. I have considered ordering it online from King Arthur Flour, but so far the Wegmans store brand has always been pretty consistent and dependable that they have it. Let me know in the comments below where you like to shop. In my area in South Jersey, I have to admit we're spoiled. Within 3 miles of my home, I have probably 8 supermarkets. That goes to show you how large and populated my town is here in South Jersey. But at any given point, I have plenty of choices when it comes to supermarkets. ShopRite, Wegmans, Acme, Aldi, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods even, Mom's Organic Market, Costco, BJ's, Walmart, Sam's Club, you name it, and we have it. So I'm very fortunate that I can price hunt and know exactly where the best ingredients for my home bakery can be bought. Okay, I'm going to set aside these 2 bowls of streusel topping for when it comes time to sprinkle the batter. And we're going to dive in to our base, our cake batter. I always prefer to use my KitchenAid mixer. It really does make life easy. We're going to use the paddle attachment. And as most cakes, we're going to start by creaming our butter and our sugar. Unlike some of my other recipes where the butter needs to be at room temperature, this crumb cake recipe is awesome to make in a pinch because it calls for melted butter. So that makes life a little easier. You don't have to plan ahead. You can just simply either microwave the butter or melt it on the stovetop. And I think that does a really great job of helping the sugar and the butter to incorporate. And as in my other recipes, the creaming of the butter and sugar is an important stage because this is where you're taking the time, often 5 minutes or more, to add all of the air into the butter and the sugar, and that will always help result in a light and fluffy cake at the end. So because my portion size is only 1/8 of a sheet pan, that's about a 8 by 6 size piece of crumb cake. My ingredients are very small in quantity. And as I often do, I am practicing the art and of mise en place, getting all of my ingredients ready in serving bowls so that I can keep pace with the recipe, and it just makes life so much easier. So I do encourage you to practice the mise en place, in that you won't start a recipe until all of your ingredients are measured. So for instance, because my crumb cake is such a small portion, I'm only using 150 grams of pastry flour. Whereas if I were baking a 1.5 or 2 pound loaf of bread, I could be using up to 500 grams of flour. So in this particular day, I do have an order for 2 crumb cakes. And often in a larger batch bakery, you'd be making, multiple serving sizes in one batch, which I can do. And then you could weigh out your batter and to partition it correctly into each of your pans. The benefit of being a small batch bakery is I don't have to do that. And I find that doing each batch separate on some days is easier when it comes to like a quick bread or a crumb cake. Now, if I were making multiple batches of my challah bread or my cinnamon buns, I absolutely would make a larger batch thanks to my KitchenAid 6-quart bowl. It can handle quite a lot. And I find bread dough much easier to weigh and partition. This crumb cake recipe is similar to my pound cake recipe in that it requires alternating your dry ingredients. So your pastry flour, your baking powder, and your salt, alternating that with your milk and vanilla when we're starting to incorporate them into our sugar and butter and egg mixture. Again, that's a common technique with cakes. You might have recognized it. All of these nuances and different approaches result in different types of cakes. And it's really exciting to learn at school. I am enrolled in a culinary program at my local community college, and I am currently in a progressive culinary class. But next semester, I dive back into baking, baking 2, and it's going to be all about pastry. And then baking 3 is all about cakes and cake decorating. So I just absolutely love learning the science behind all of these techniques. Okay, all of our ingredients are weighed out, and now we can get started. So I'm putting in 105 grams of granulated white sugar, and also that melted butter, 75 grams of unsalted melted butter into my KitchenAid with the paddle attachment. And in true fashion, there I am scraping every last bit of butter. With such a small batch, every little bit counts, and I love these miniature scrapers to get that sort of task done. Now I am going to set this for about 5 minutes. I want it to be very light, a very creamy, light yellow and fluffy. So in the meantime, I'll prepare my eggs. I only actually need 1 beaten egg in this recipe. This original recipe actually comes from my culinary baking textbook, and it is meant for a full sheet pan, which if you bake in your kitchen a lot and use a cookie sheet, a standard cookie sheet is half a sheet pan. So the original crumb cake recipe called for 2 of those. So it's quite a large portion. I am using just 1/8 of a sheet pan, which is a more manageable size. So I have edited the video. So the butter and the sugar had whipped for a good 5 minutes. And I am slowly going to incorporate my egg. And as we've learned on other videos, anytime we're using our KitchenAid with butter and incorporating egg, it's very important to scrape down the sides of our bowl. We don't want to leave any bit of the ingredients unmixed. And that Rubbermaid heat resistant scraper is my go-to while baking as well. So even though I only have 1 egg in this recipe, I am still adding it in stages. There's only so much egg that can be added to butter. There's sort of a limit to how much a butter can handle when we're incorporating egg. And that's why we add it more slowly to be sure that it's fully incorporated. I'm going to give this a chance to mix and get a little light and fluffy again. So right now we've got the added egg in with the whipped butter and sugar. Patience is your friend here. These are stages that you don't want to skimp on. And I want to show you what it looks like before we start incorporating the liquid and the dry ingredients. A nice light color and pretty fluffy. So even with that yolk in the egg, it's still a very light yellow from all of the butter and air and sugar being incorporated. So at this stage, I choose to add my dry ingredients with a sifter at this point. You are welcome to sift all of your ingredients first and then add them. My idea here is that it won't sit in the bowl and get clumpy again. So because we're alternating dry and wet ingredients, and again, we're doing this for mostly so that we're not clumping our flour, but we also don't want to overmix this batter. We've just whipped a lot of air into it, and we don't want that to get canceled out by overmixing. So if you notice, I am on the lowest setting right now, the stir setting, which is the first one. And as soon as I see that flour mixture incorporated, I'm going to add my liquid. So again, the alternating method, I typically break my dry ingredients down into thirds and my wet ingredients down into halves. So my first addition was a third of my dry flour mixture and then half of my wet mixture, followed by the second third of my flour mixture, followed by the final half of my liquid, and then the final third of my flour. And again, this is meant to slow down the process, only stir as much as is needed to incorporate it. It's very unlike sort of a box cake mix. If you've ever made a box cake mix, when we're making that sort of cake, even if we're making it from scratch, we want to whip this stage. We put all of that flour and all the ingredients at once and whip all the air in at the end. For this kind of cake, we don't want that. We don't want it over mixed. So this slows the process down, and the KitchenAid being at stir is ensuring that I am not going to overmix. So I keep a close eye on it. And as soon as I see that flour disappear into, again, that sifted flour and salt and baking powder disappear into the batter, I know it's time to add my milk and vanilla. And I find that once you've done a recipe, right, once you've read it through completely and actually have done it once, it always becomes easier the next time. So this might seem a little detail oriented, but it'll pay off in the end, and you'll have such a lovely texture crumb cake that I'm sure you'll be encouraged to make it again. So here's my final third of my flour, my baking powder, and my salt. And I do always use kosher salt. I think there's only one recipe that I found that calls for table salt. But kosher salt is my baking go-to. So we're nearly done. That final bit of flour is fully incorporated, and I'm going to scrape down the sides to make sure that every bit is mixing in. Let me know in the comments below what kind of mixer you prefer to use. Plenty of these recipes can be done by hand as well, certainly a hand mixer. But if you have a stand mixer, let me know. This batter is almost marshmallowy. It's so thick, but light at the same time. It's just lovely. And I'm going to prepare my 8th sheet pan. These are a great brand, Nordic Ware. Again, just consistent. And I am sizing out my parchment paper. This makes it easier for me in the end to pull the crumb cake off the pan and put it into the bakery box for my customers. If I were making it for my family, I might not use the parchment paper. This batter is so buttery, it has never stuck in a pan as far as when I've made it. I'm going to use the other pan to sort of help me press that paper down. And that's the 8th sheet pan. So again, if you're making cookies at home, you're usually using a half of a sheet pan. I do have quarter sheet pans as well. I find having, just like you have stacking stainless steel bowls for every use, I find that all of the different sizes of sheet pans come in handy. In my culinary and baking classes at school, we often use the full sheet pan, as those are the quantities that we're working in, and the convection ovens in the lab in the classroom can handle those large full-size sheet pans. So I'm going to scrape out my batter onto the pan. And because it is so thick, it does require a little bit of smoothing out, getting it into all the corners. That is what makes a crumb cake base a little bit different, right? It's not like a golden cake that you might make to ice. This needs to have a little more structure in order to support the crumbs. So it is a thicker batter, but it does still come out very light and fluffy in the end. It's really just a lovely recipe. I hope you look at the show notes and give it a try on your own. I do love sharing my recipes. So if I had made a double batch, I would be weighing this out on the scale as I poured it out. But since I know this is just a single batch, all of it has to go into this pan. And I'll smooth out the top. Just again, this is for even baking, not so much for appearances because the crumbs are going to cover the top, but I do want it to be even thickness and covering the whole pan so that I know it will bake evenly. I do rotate my baked goods in my oven as well. So for instance, this is going to bake in a 360-degree oven for 30 minutes. So at about 10 or 15 minutes in, I will rotate the pan 180 degrees. I do have an electric oven with my gas stovetop, so I do know that electric ovens are more even, but I always still rotate just to be sure. So my streusel topping has been sitting aside all this time while we were making the batter. And I'm just going to start incorporating the butter with my fork. You could also use a pastry knife. I am going to need a bigger bowl. I'm going to dump this into a larger bowl in a second, and then use my fingertips to rub and blend the ingredients together. We want to keep the butter temperature as stable as we can, so I'm not going to squeeze it in my palms. Using fingertips or a pastry knife or a fork will keep the butter temperature better. I've done this always. I've done it with ice cold butter cubed right from the fridge, and I've done it with butter that's been sitting out for about the half an hour that it takes me to make the batter. And I really don't see too much of a difference. And in fact, letting the butter sit out with the streusel topping for about an hour actually makes it a little easier to incorporate. But I do find the trick here is to keep it in coarse crumbles, nothing too large. I know, again, I always enjoyed the large crumbs on my grandma's crumb cake. Her recipe was slightly different though, but this makes for more of an even product in the end. And this way, every slice that you cut looks like every slice that's left. No fighting over the large crumbs, as my cousins and I used to do. And also it makes for an easier cutting. When you cut into this cake, it's not going to, the topping, the crumbles are not going to break off. I always think back to the previous generations of bakers and how strong and endurant they must have been to do all of these things without the modern tools that we have now. Their arms and hands were so strong, kneading dough and rolling out crust and all the different things that they did. It's really admirable. So I'm going to sprinkle my streusel topping on my batter. This recipe actually, when I divided it down into eighths, right? The original recipe from my textbook was a full-size sheet pan. So my batter recipe is an eighth of what was in my textbook. I actually did not do the streusel recipe into eighths. I did want a little more crumb topping. So I believe my crumb topping is like 1.5 times the amount that an eighth of a sheet pan would actually call for. So again, I do recognize that the crumbs are some of the best parts. And I find that this bakes really nice with that 1.5 times crumbs. But all that to say, have fun and experiment and play around with your quantities. That's how you make a recipe yours over the years. All right, we're all set. It's going into the 360-degree oven for about 30 minutes. Please like and subscribe. The Crooked Spoon.